Well, thank you for that wonderful, warm welcome, and thank you to the various sponsoring groups. I've met most of those involved, and they also have made me feel very at home. In fact, they almost made me feel too much at home. It looked as if it was going to rain this afternoon, and I didn't think that was necessary. I do very much appreciate this Irish flag that is here in front of the podium, and I particularly appreciate having the opportunity to come here to the University of Oregon here in Eugene and to talk to you about quite a serious subject, and to be encouraged that so many of you want to come out and want to discuss human rights and discuss globalization. And for me, the part that I begin to really enjoy is when we have that discussion. So I hope that I will start a conversation and that then we will really have an opportunity to dialogue, have a question and answer, have some comments and feedback. Because I'm talking about two issues that often give rise to completely different ideas for people. Take, for example, human rights. In my experience, in an audience like this, when you mention human rights, it actually means different things to many people. People think of political prisoners. They think of refugee camps, of conflict. They think of countries like maybe Cuba or China or some parts of Africa. And the words mean a sort of range of images. I don't think that often enough other images come to mind. But if I was talking and using the words human rights in many developing countries, the first thing that would come to their mind would be, well, safety from conflict. But after that, food security, uncontaminated water, health, will my child have education, shelter? And these are also part of human rights at the international level. And when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, I used to emphasize a great deal that this is the broad and balanced agenda. And I used to mention quite often a wonderful American woman who played a key role, as you'll recall, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was chair of the Commission of Human Rights in Geneva that drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there's a very vivid account of that period and of her work in particular, but also the work of the eminent lawyers who worked with her. It's a book called A World Made New, and it's written by Professor Mary Ann Glendon, who's in the law school in Harvard University. And it's a very good human account, but very detailed. And what I liked about it was that the Universal Declaration was a truly universal document. It drew on the great religions of the world. It looked at the humanist tradition. It involved an eminent Chinese scholar, an eminent scholar from the Lebanon, René Cassin of France, John Humphreys of Canada. And Eleanor Roosevelt made a virtue of the fact that she herself wasn't a lawyer. She was the widow of a president. She had been very well known in journalism, but she wasn't a lawyer. So she bossed them, and she bullied them, in fact. And she said, don't write the Universal Declaration in lawyers' language, because if I can't understand it, how will it be understood in small places close to home, where human rights must matter, if they're going to matter at all? And to her great credit and their great credit, it's written in straightforward language. And it embraces this broader agenda. It talks about civil and political rights, fair trial, the rights to liberty, free press, freedom of religion, and so on. But it also talks about the adequate standard of living, the right to food and safe water and health and education and shelter. And at the end, I'm going to come to another dimension of the Universal Declaration that we don't hear enough about when I challenge you well, I'll wait until the end. I won't anticipate myself. So that's the human rights agenda, a broad agenda. And then we come to another concept that we're very familiar with now. We read about it all the time. It's used in so many different ways. There's an overuse, if anything, of the word globalization. And I'm not going to bore you with definitions of it. As you know, it refers most simply to the progressive integration of economies and societies. And as you also know, this complex process has unleashed many forces, both for good and for ill. It has certainly led to increased access to cheaper goods and resources. It has revolutionized communications, and it has sparked a more rapid spread of ideas and scientific and technological progress around the world. Unfortunately, the reality of globalization has proven complicated. First, its benefits, while real, have been unevenly distributed. While globalization has worked for some of the world's people, it has also left behind or even harmed millions of others. Yes, without a doubt, globalization has helped lift millions of people out of poverty, particularly in countries such as China and India. But on the other hand, as we learned in a report about 6 months ago from the United Nations, 54 countries are poorer now than they were before the 1990s. In 21 countries, more people are going hungry. In 14 countries, more children are dying before the age of 5. In 12 countries, primary school enrollments are shrinking, and life expectancy has fallen in some 34 countries, a lot of it because of this terrible HIV and AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Worldwide, the number of people living in a chronic state of poverty and daily insecurity hasn't changed much since 1990. And this is something that was picked up in a recent commission that looked at human security in a very broad way. It was a commission on human security and produced a report called Human Security Now that I actually know some students here in the university are learning about because I met their teacher at a dinner a short while ago. So I know some of you at least know what I'm talking about in this Human Security report. I want to quote a brief passage from it because the report noted that a fifth of the world's people, 1.2 billion, experience severe income poverty and live on less than $1 a day. Nearly 2/3 of them in Asia and a quarter in Africa. Another 1.6 billion live on less than $2 a day. Together, 2.8 billion of the world's people live in a chronic state of poverty and daily insecurity. And then they go on to say the point I've just made, a number that has not changed much since 1990. And actually, we're going to see this dramatic increase in world population, which has been increasing. Another 2 billion will be added in the next couple of decades, and they will be mainly in that very impoverished area. And the situation of vulnerable people, of women, of children, of indigenous minorities is particularly alarming. A few months ago, I took part in the London School of Economics in the launch of a new report on child poverty. And there is child poverty here in the United States. This report looked at about 1.2 million children in 46 countries, and it was the largest and most accurate sample ever assembled. And the findings, I think, are simply devastating. Over 1 billion children, that's 1,000 million children, more than half of all children in developing countries, suffer from severe deprivation of at least one basic human right, such as shelter, food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, or health care. And over 1/3 of children, and then, again, a huge proportion, suffer from what is described as absolute poverty. And that's defined as 2 or more severe deprivations of things as elementary as food, safe drinking water, sanitation, healthcare. I remember visiting a slum in Delhi, in India, where I was going to a project of a very small civil society organization, local Indian organization, and they called themselves STOP, S-T-O-P. And indeed, I gather that the Indian authorities weren't too happy that I was going there because it wasn't entirely safe in a very densely populated, extremely poor area along a riverbank with no sanitation, very bad road, very hard to get there by car, so we had to walk a certain distance. And I went into a small place and found a project run mainly by women, though not entirely, and they had 3 areas of focus. One was on education for children in the immediate surrounds, because so many of them were orphans from violence, orphans from HIV and AIDS, and they would have had no opportunity for schooling. They weren't in the system in any way without this project. The second issue was the health of the women themselves, and they were having training, they were focusing on their health. And the third thing they were doing was economic. They were making a small income from making candles, and they presented me with a bundle of these candles. And then there was a television crew with me. I was there as High Commissioner. There was a bit of a sort of fuss, and it was a way of bringing home the reality of what it is to be living in poverty. And when we came out, they said to me, before you go, can the children sing for you? And I hadn't really noticed that as we came out into this narrow laneway with sewage running down the middle of it, there were a whole lot of children squatting down. And they stood up and they sang beautifully in Hindi, "We shall overcome." And they sang it right to the end. And of course, for me, it evoked so many memories of my time as a law student in Harvard during the late 60s. I'm the class of 68, I'm that old. And the civil rights movement in the South, and the many times we sang that song. It reminded me of the fighting apartheid in South Africa. And then it was a song sung by children in the depth of poverty, full of hope, full of determination that we shall overcome. And after that, and even in fact before that, when I was asked by journalists, what is the worst problem in human rights in the world, you know, from your experience as High Commissioner, I would answer absolute poverty. And it wasn't the answer that most journalists wanted. They wanted me to pick a country or pick an issue like torture, and there is a lot of torture in the world. But in fact, when you live in absolute poverty, you have no rights. You are abused by the police if you come into contact with them. You don't vote. You have no voice in anything. And you bury your children young. You die young yourself. Your life is brutish and short. And it is full of a despair and a sense of hopelessness. And that's why it's so wonderful when you see the community spirit that I saw in that small project, which is typical of many, many others that I saw, of a fight back, of a determination, and yet of how difficult it is. So we're faced with a world that is so divided. It's quite incredible that we can meet here in the state of Oregon that I can feel extremely at home in. The population is just a little less than the population of Ireland. It's green, as I said, the weather is somewhat like my native Ireland, and there are many similarities. And we can talk together, and while we are talking, a very significant number, something over 1,000 children, will die unnecessarily of preventable diseases. Over 6 million children die each year of hunger, more than double the population of Oregon. And these are realities that organizations like UNICEF tell us in a statistical sense, and I think they just go over our head. But I have had the opportunity as High Commissioner, when I say it's not an opportunity, it's a devastating experience, of being at feeding stations and seeing children, babies and young children, die in the arms of their parents because they couldn't get to the feeding station in time to be saved. I've seen it in refugee camps where children didn't have possibility of a mosquito net or vital medicines and just die unnecessarily. I'm now on the vaccine fund, which is tackling the issue of vaccination. But 30 million children in our world today never get vaccination. We're trying to reach an additional 10 million children, and the project of the Vaccine Fund is making very serious inroads. But this is the kind of world that we face. And it's for that reason, that when I finished my term as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I felt it would be useful to bring the experience of having seen what that system meant into the issues of globalization generally, and in particular to argue for the need to bridge these divides, to build a real human security through tackling these issues. And my conviction is that a world connected by technology, information, transportation, and commerce must also be connected by a core of shared values. And I see human rights as central to this wider value system, and, if you like, as constituting rules of the road for an ethical or values-led globalization that aims to benefit all the world's people. It won't mean that we will all have the same standard of living, but that we will not live in a world which has such an amoral, immoral, unethical, unacceptable divide, where so many people have no hope, no prospects, no way of having a decent job, a decent living. And if you look at the international system, and I'll keep it at a sort of simple level because it's really the frame of it that's important, every country in the world has ratified at least one of the 6 key international human rights treaties. And many countries have ratified somewhere between 3 and 6 of these treaties. Quite a number of countries have ratified all 6. And they are, I'll just name them briefly: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Both of those have been ratified by more than 140 countries. I think in one case it's 145, in the other case about 147. The Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has been ratified by 175 countries. The Convention Against Torture by, again, a very large number. The Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Racism. And the final one, the Convention for the Rights of the Rights of the Child, has been ratified by every country in the world except 2. And you may come back to me later when I tell you that one of those 2 is the United States and the other is Somalia. And it is interesting that this frame of an international treaty on child rights lacks the support of this great country. It's an interesting issue, and one I think that warrants to be talked about more. And the reason that I mention the numbers is that we do have a value system if we implement it. But unfortunately, as you will appreciate, many of the commitments that governments make are paper commitments. The ratification is there, but it's not implemented in practice, and the structures are not put in place to fully implement. So the real job of work is the work of implementing and holding to accountability governments that have made these commitments. Now, some of you may be thinking that at the time we live in, that it is difficult to have a new focus on human rights. After all, we know that since the terrible attacks here in the United States of the 11th of September of 9/11, there has been growing concern that the real focus has to be on security, and that human rights somehow cannot have the same attention, the same focus. In my view, that is a response which is understandable, a response of a real focus on human security and on combating acts of terrorism. I'm all for and believe it's extraordinarily important to combat acts of terrorism. But if we reflect on what actually happened on that terrible day, it wasn't just a deliberate attack using aeroplanes full of people with full gasoline tanks aimed at buildings to kill as many people as possible. It was also a deliberate attack on democratic values, on the values that were represented. And that's extremely clear. So in rightly focusing on securing people, protecting people, having human security, it's also, I believe, extremely important to hold to those values. And the Human Rights Code, the International Covenant, for example, on civil and political rights, allows for certain derogations in times of acute pressure of that kind when it is necessary to put a focus on human security. But there are very real safeguards and limits. And one of the concerns which I was very conscious of during my last year as High Commissioner, which was the year after 9/11, as it happened. I ended my term on the 11th of September 2002. During that last year, I found it necessary to express criticism publicly in my capacity as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights about certain measures taken in the United States, because it was particularly important to criticize, because the United States was viewed, very definitely viewed, as the standard bearer for human rights and civil liberties in this area. So if the standards were being eroded, that had a very worrying knock-on effect in other countries that didn't have the kinds of checks and balances which the United States had. And this became very evident. There were a number of problems. There were the lack of clarification of the status of prisoners held in Guantanamo Bay. There was the use of immigration laws to hold people for very long periods without access to lawyers or to their family, or indeed to expel them from the country without any process. And there was the issue of the United States citizens who were designated as unlawful combatants and without the safeguards of the Constitution, and so on. But one of the differences in a country like the United States, with its strong democratic tradition, is that even when you have a difficult time and steps are taken, you also have incredible checks and balances. You have the courts, you have academics who speak and write about, you have civil society, NGOs, like Lawyers' Committee for Human Rights. The most effective criticism and sort of stock-taking of the erosion of civil liberties here in the United States since 9/11 that I've come across is a report by Lawyers' Committee for Human Rights based in New York called Assessing the New Normal, Liberty and Security for the Post-September the 11th United States. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I do recommend it. It's on their website, because it really is quite striking how quickly there was a very serious erosion of civil liberties in this country. And they also deal with the knock-on effect, with the changes in security law in countries that don't have the checks and balances which the United States has, countries of the former Soviet Union, some Asian countries, some countries in the Muslim world. And what happened was human rights rapporteurs were coming back to me with reports that in certain countries, political parties were being characterized as being terrorist. There was a suppression of freedom of the press. Acts of political protest were being designated to be terrorist activities in a way that hadn't happened before, and clamped down, therefore, on freedom of expression. And all of this hard to challenge, because when these issues were taken up with those countries, they would say, oh, but the standards have changed. And I would get very uptight about that and say, no, they haven't changed. I'm in charge. I'm the High Commissioner. I'm in charge of that. They haven't changed. And they would say, look at what's happening in the country that was the standard bearer. So coming then to how to look forward in a way that will help us to bridge these divides, and also to cope with the genuine feeling of human insecurity worldwide after 9/11. I think if there's one issue that everybody responds to, it is a sense that we are all less secure. But the reasons for that human insecurity are not quite the same in different parts of the world, and that's also maybe part of a perception divide. Here in the United States, in Europe, I think probably in Japan and some other countries, the increased insecurity is a fear of a terrible attack, a chemical or a biological or even perhaps a nuclear attack. There is that real fear, and it's very deep now, and people are nervy and understandably concerned about it. in a lot of developing countries, poor countries that I've been talking about, the insecurity is the entrenched, continuing insecurity about where the next meal will come from, where we'll get medicine for a dying child. Will I ever have a possibility of getting any job, never mind a decent job? Will I ever be able to get out of here? How will I possibly survive the circumstances in which I find myself? But there is that real shared, for different reasons, sense of insecurity, which is why that report on human security was, I believe, very important. But I want to remind us, because for some reason this is something that has been quickly forgotten by a lot of people, that this short century began very well in human rights terms. And it was a moment that I was terribly encouraged by. The moment was September 2000, a year before 9/11. When there was the largest gathering ever of world leaders at the UN for what was called the Millennium Assembly. And the world leaders, on behalf of all the countries in the world, adopted the Millennium Declaration, which was a formal commitment, and it was then worked on, particularly in the UN, to identify, in simpler terms, if you like, key goals that the world leaders had committed to, and committed to in specific timeframes. And those goals were simple and straightforward and extraordinarily important. To have those living in world poverty and hunger, in absolute poverty and hunger by 2015. To have every child have access to full primary education, girls and boys, by 2015. To remove discrimination against the girl child, which is very prevalent in a number of countries, to cut down on maternal mortality, on child mortality, to deal with HIV and AIDS, to have access to water and sanitation and prevent environmental degradation. These were the very clear goals. And of course, if you agree, as the world did at the beginning of this century, on those goals, it's important to know, well, what does this cost? And there was a special conference, if you may recall, in Monterrey in Mexico, which looked at the cost. It was called the Conference on Financing for Development. And just before that conference, the Bush administration, President Bush, announced the Millennium Challenge Account, which was new development money from the United States, a very significant increase in pre-existing development aid. But the overall global cost, not just what the United States would be contributing, but the global cost to meet these new goals in the timeline of 2015 was estimated by a team of reputable economists led by Ernesto Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, who's currently the director of the Center for the Study of Globalization in Yale University. He and his colleagues estimated that it would require an additional $50 billion a year. And when I first heard that figure, you know, an extra 50 billion in global money well targeted to meet these goals, it seemed a great deal of money. But somehow, in the last couple of years, it hasn't seemed anything like as much, and you know why. Because we've heard these figures of global military spending in excess of $800 billion a year. And even the figures for Iraq, for maintaining the military and for rebuilding in Iraq. And it's just the importance of getting back to the priorities we had and finding that very manageable sum of money. The new money committed comes to about 12 billion additional US dollars instead of 50 billion. And the trouble is now that all of those goals are slipping. We're not going to achieve. We may statistically achieve more or less the first goal of having those in absolute poverty because China and India have pulled so much of their population out of absolute poverty. But overall, as I said, the figures don't bridge the kinds of divides that I was talking about. So in the project that I'm leading now with this what my Irish friends call very highfalutin title, the Ethical Globalization Initiative. What they said, in fact, was worse than that. They said it's a hell of a highfalutin title for a very small project, and they're quite right. But it's a project that does have hefty partners, the Aspen Institute and Columbia University as two partners here in the United States, and in Geneva, a very good council of human rights experts, the International Council on Human Rights Policy. And what we're trying to do is bring both the human rights norms and standards that I talked about, that most countries have signed up to, at least part of, if not all of the regime, to bring that and also the commitment to the Millennium Goals into the discussion about globalization, and to have a more values-led globalization. We're talking about it with the World Bank, we're talking about it with the WTO, with the IMF, we're talking about it at the WTO discussions in Cancun that I was present at. We're talking about it in the context of migration, of the fact that you have, if you like, three freedoms in globalization, but not the fourth. You have free movement of goods, services and capital, but you don't have free movement of the people who need to look for jobs. Now, I'm not saying that you have to open all borders, but we do need to look at migration in a much more positive way and begin to match those who desperately need jobs with where jobs are, or else bring jobs to them, or have a much more human-centered approach to issues of migration, because what we're seeing at the moment is the harsh approach to refugees and asylum seekers, and it's much more harsh since 9/11, and the closing of borders, and Europe is much worse than the United States in this area. Let me be fair, I've said some tough things about some of the recent United States policy, but on migrants, Europe is a fortress Europe. It is very unyielding and unable to see that it's in the economic interests of European countries that have aging populations, that it's better for the economic progress of Europe to embrace diversity and multiculturalism and to have a whole new approach to issues of migration. But that is being resisted, as we know, and what it is doing in human rights terms, of course, is driving so many desperate migrants into the hands of criminal gangs that make great money from bringing migrants in very unsafe conditions. Or you also have the terrible dark side of globalization, the trafficking in human beings, in women and in children for sex or for forced labor, for finding them then when they come to countries without papers, completely dependent. It's a new form of slavery in many ways. And so we need to address, and happily there is now a new commission on migration to address that issue. And where does this come home in a university like the University of Oregon, or a community like the community here in Eugene? I think that the best way to bring it home is to go back to that small part of the Universal Declaration that I skipped over at the beginning. I talked about the broad way in which it protects rights, but I also wanted to refer to the fact that it is a document that I think is truly universal because it has an important dimension that to me wouldn't be characterized as being Western. A lot of people think, well, the Universal Declaration is a Western agenda, but I'm going to read you an article of it which to me is much more the philosophical approach and approach of solidarity and of a community. It's like the Ubuntu principles in Africa. It's like an Asian sense of solidarity than a Western approach. It's Article 29, Paragraph 1 of the Universal Declaration, which says, "Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible." Now, you'll have to remember that the Universal Declaration was adopted in December of 1948, so it wasn't so gender sensitive, but I've met some very strong gender women's studies people here already in the university this afternoon. So I want to read this in a more gender-sensitive way so we can think about it again. And in that way, it says, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his or her personality is possible. If we break that down, it's extremely interesting. First of all, we all have a duty to community, but who is the community? Is it the community here locally, in the university, in the city, in the state of Oregon, in the United States, or now in our world, does it include Haiti? I mean, who is community? How far do we stretch? So that's something to think about. Everyone has a duty to community. And the clear inference, the clear meaning is, not only do you have a duty, but you must do something about it. And if you don't know that you have a duty and act on that and do something about it, you yourself have not fully developed your personality. You are not a fully whole person in one sense, unless you have that link with community. And interestingly, if I can just, with my Irish flag there down to remind me, if I could wear my Irish hat for a moment, when I was President of Ireland, or really when I was a candidate seeking votes to become President, I noted one of the great strengths at that time in 1990 in Ireland was a commitment to local self-development. Ireland had reached a certain stage of prosperity in the European Union, not as much as it had during the 90s, but it had begun that process. But a lot of the services and supports and community facilities were in Dublin as the capital city, or Cork, or maybe one or two other places. And a lot of people in rural areas or smaller towns wanted similar sports facilities, places for old people, refuges for battered wives, and so on. But they realized that the central government wasn't going to do what they hoped, and they'd asked for long enough. So they just said, look, we'll do it ourselves. We'll just make it work. We'll work together and we'll do it. And this happened in an extraordinary fashion and meant that there was a huge provision of supports and services and clubs and things. And they used an Irish word over and over again to describe this. And the word was mehel. And so I was meeting mehel clubs, mehel communities, the spirit of mehel. I was invited to launch a mehel project for young people and so on. And that word mehel means linked with neighbour. There's no English word, as I would point out rather pointedly, to explain. But it comes from the fact that Ireland was an agricultural country, that it had a strong tradition of working on one farmer's field 1 week, and then everybody moved to the next farmer for the harvesting, and so on. There was a working with neighbour, a mehel, because you were connected to your neighbour. And that's very similar to that idea of everyone having a duty to community, without which you yourself are not full, have not developed your full personality. And another thing that I used to do when I was President of Ireland was to recognise that if you really want to convey something, if you really want to say something, you're looking for the words, it's much better to go to the poets. Ireland has a surplus of really good poets, and they really do put things very well. And in this connection, there's a poem of Seamus Heaney's. Seamus Heaney got the Nobel Prize for Literature some years ago, and he is an extremely well-known and well-loved figure in Ireland, and he has reached out in a particular way, and he wrote a poem for Amnesty International, and he just gifted it to them, so there's no copyright or anything. And when I was taking up my post, going from being President of Ireland to become High Commissioner in Geneva, I got a framed copy of this poem from Amnesty in Ireland, wishing me well, and it was signed by Seamus, and it was behind my desk for the 5 years that I was in Geneva. And it's a poem that I think captures this idea of duty to community, of how to have a dimension of self that is very enriching but also quite demanding. The poem is called From the Republic of Conscience, And I could synopsize it, but it would be a shame. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to read it and more or less end with that so we can have a good discussion. From the Republic of Conscience. When I landed in the Republic of Conscience, it was so noiseless when the engines stopped, I could hear a curlew high above the runway. At immigration, the clerk was an old man who produced a wallet from his homespun coat and showed me a photograph of my grandfather. The woman in customs asked me to declare the words of our traditional cures and charms to heal dumbness and avert the evil eye. No porters, no interpreters, no taxi. You carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of creeping privilege disappeared. Fog is a dreaded omen there, but lightning spells universal good, and parents hang swaddled infants in trees during thunderstorms. Salt is their precious mineral, and seashells are held to the ear during births and funerals. The base of all inks and pigments is seawater. Their sacred symbol is a stylized boat. The sail is an ear, the mast a sloping pen, the hull a mouth shape, the keel an open eye. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep, to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt and tears which the sky god wept after he dreamt his solitude was endless. I came back from that frugal republic with my 2 arms the one length, the customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me, when I got home, to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. So you see how the poet takes that notion. You go to the Republic of Conscience. You have an experience there that he has described in very poetic terms, and certainly your creeping privilege disappears. And when you come back from that Republic of Conscience, you are a dual citizen. And you remain a dual citizen because no ambassador is ever relieved. And then you have to ask yourself, what can I do? And once you've started to ask that question, it's remarkable that you can always find that you can do, and that you can do locally, and that you can do other things. But that the important thing is to be that dual citizen, be that ambassador of conscience, and ask those questions. Thank you for being such a good audience. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
We have now time for questions and answers, about 25 minutes, I believe. And I ask you, please, don't make presentations. Ask your questions, because many people want to ask questions.
Hello? Cade Middle-Falscha, August Thurscha.
Agar Magat.
100,000 welcomes and freedom to you in Oregon. And the new Lodge 6 were unarmed men gunned down by the British military and its agents without provocation or warning in the New Lodge Road area of North Belfast. The British and British military forces were, they failed to investigate and positively respond or engage to the murders. The families now seek petition with United Nations Special Rapporteur about these summary and arbitrary executions. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are, and if you feel any need to do anything about that. It's hard to ask this question after all the awareness about poverty, world poverty.
What I'd like to do is answer it in a more general way. I think it has been very important in the context of Northern Ireland that it has been possible to bring issues outside at times. Very important cases were brought to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and there are still cases in the pipeline where issues. Ireland brought a case against the United Kingdom at one stage and was successful in relation to the methods of interrogation that were used in detention centres in Northern Ireland. There have been individual cases. It's therefore part of that legitimate process of seeking ways to vindicate, to bring justice. I'm not going to comment on the particular case, but the idea of going to the rapporteur is a way of doing that. And maybe it's just illustrates in its own way that although human rights are best protected locally, in fact, I often felt in Geneva that you don't protect human rights from the outside. They must be strong locally. And that's a lot of the problem in various countries, and it was for a very long time a problem in a Northern Ireland context. But in broad terms, happily the situation has improved, though politically it's still not fully secure in the north.
Yeah. I'm an Irish American, and I've been following your activities as President and High Commissioner in the Irish Echo, which is a New York publication.
I know the Irish Echo, yes.
And they've done some recent features on you, as you know. I wanted to know, Ireland has, for a long time, been active as a country in a variety of different ways in these kind of issues. And I wondered if that has to do with the fact that Ireland, along with very few other European countries, was colonized and not a colonial power. And secondly, Ireland in the 1850s went through the Great Hunger. And I don't know whether that's taught in Irish schools today. It wasn't for a long time. It is possible to teach that in Oregon now. There's a law that's been passed, sponsored by Tony Corcoran, a native of Cork City, but it's pretty much unknown and ignored here. And I think that it's analogous to the Armenian genocide and a number of other things. And I wondered if you thought the history of Ireland had anything to do with the Irish concern for these kind of issues. And as an economist, I want to mention that the success of the Irish economy had a lot to do with the development of the Irish regional technical colleges, and I thought maybe you'd explain briefly what they are. And thank you very much for being here.
Okay. Well, on the first part of your question, the sense of identification with developing countries because of Irish history is very strong. It's very strong because the 150th anniversary of the Irish famine took place over 3 years while I was president, and all the schools in Ireland were doing projects on the famine and linking it with the current situation in developing countries. And there is a wonderful story which links with an act of wonderful humanity from this country when Ireland was suffering from that terrible famine. And it involved the Choctaw people. They had been driven from their tribal lands, and they had come together in Oklahoma, which they'd been driven to, in the spring of 1847 to mark the 10th anniversary of what they call the Vale of Tears, the terrible displacement that they had suffered. And 1847 was the 3rd year of the devastating Irish potato famine. And at that stage, the stronger, if you like, in their desperation, had left and emigrated to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, etc. It was the poorer and even the feebler who were dying at home and who weren't even able to get to the coffin ships as they were. But during that meeting in the spring of 1847, the Choctaw people learned, and we aren't quite sure how, there's a theory that it may have been a priest who passed through that area and talked to some of them. They learned about an island far away where people were starving because their crop had failed. And that they understood, the single crop, and if the crop fails, well then you're in real difficulty. And the Choctaw people raised $173 and sent it for the relief of Irish famine victims. And we know all about that. We know how the money was spent because the Victorians were very good at the bookkeeping part of things. So they kept it. And as President of Ireland, I went to Oklahoma and formally thanked the Choctaw people. In fact, I'm an honorary chieftain of the Choctaw people. But the reason that I particularly mention that is it's a reminder to us that nothing really in history of people is forgotten, none of the really significant points. And that's why the Irish famine is very well remembered. And so is a good deed, just as bad deeds in history linger on and are a problem. So I think that that was a story that I liked to tell. And if the story of the famine is being talked about, it's a very relevant one because the motivation was pure humanitarian concern. There was no other link that we know of. It was just a simple human gesture, and it is very often the case that it is the poorest who turn out to be the most generous, the most giving, because they know what it's like to be dirt poor and hungry. Just on the technical colleges, I agree with you, but I think it's an even broader point. I think part of the strength of the way in which Ireland benefited so rapidly in its economic progress, and membership of the European Union was certainly very helpful in that, was because of the emphasis on education, the status of teachers, the regional technical colleges, all of that emphasis. In other words, in Ireland we would have said it's education stupid, and I think we were right.
We have second microphone at the end of this room, so please, we had 2 people here, then 2 people from back microphone.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for coming all the way to our little town. Many of these terrible travesties that we have talked about, both 9/11 and some of the things that happened to the American Indians in this country, have been have happened largely because of media. People in the East were fed newspaper reports about these horrible Indians that were killing everybody, and so they said, yeah, send the army out there and kill them all. And a lot of people there's been terrible things going on in the media in this country since 9/11, and something that we refer to as the Johnny One-Note Press. Now, there's a lot of complicated issues. People are talking a lot about getting back hold of the media, getting more voices into the media, getting more points of view, while in our country, which has all this strange conundrums and contradictions of being so free and so independent and so human rights oriented, that we're going off in the opposite direction and being totally fascist. So the question is about media. The media is supposedly so free, we can't do anything to control it. And it ends up being totally controlled by moneyed interests, which is supposedly free enterprise, but then it actually ends up silencing all voices, etc. These are big issues that I would love to hear what you might say about that.
Yes, it is, as you say, both a big issue and a complex one. Obviously, it is extraordinarily important to have freedom of the press, freedom of the media, but I think we're all concerned. It's not just here in the United States. I think there's also quite a concern in European countries about monopolies building up, about a lack of diversity in the voices, and I think that was one of the points you were making. At the same time, in some ways, the internet has opened up another whole capacity to communicate. I think that there is certainly a responsibility in the media, but I think we can't blame the media for what are political issues that have to be dealt with at the political level, and indeed by communities holding their political public figures to accountability in this area. I do feel, it's not quite the point you were making, but I'll just say it because I feel it quite myself, being based now in New York. I feel that because this is a very large and diverse country, the coverage of the other world, the world that I'm very identified with now and care about a great deal, the stark world that's hanging on by the fingernails and not quite hanging on, and desperately poor, and where there's a lot of conflict associated with that, that world doesn't get covered anything like as much as I would wish. When it does, it can be very powerful, and there was a powerful series of editorials in the New York Times called Harvesting Poverty, and in fact they've kept it on their website. So if you go to the website of the New York Times, there's a terrific set of stories about the impact of trade policy on preventing poorer countries from trading out of poverty. And if we had more of that, I would be happier with the media. Yeah.
Please, another person from back microphone. And again, I beg you not to make presentations, because we have 10 people asking questions.
The idea of human rights seems slightly absurd without recognizing the rights of plants and animals. And I wonder if any of this can be achieved without distinct limitations on the rights of money. And do you see this as being something that we have an option of working on?
Well, earlier this afternoon when I met with some of the faculty and students in the university, I was saying that to me it was very interesting that at the first of the major world conferences, the conference in Rio in 1992, which was a conference on the environment, there was no reference to human rights. And then the year after that, there was a world conference in Vienna on human rights, and there was no reference to the environment. But more recently, there was the World Conference on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, and the banner used by civil society was "No sustainable development without human rights." And I think there is now, and you have an expert here on the platform with me who came to Geneva and took part in an expert discussion which I had invited to come together of environmental experts and human rights experts. And I think in that sense, there is a willingness to have a more holistic approach and to recognize that we have to look at an environmental dimension, look at contamination, environmental degradation, all of these issues, and also that it's important for pursuing environmental values to use the process rights, as we call them, of human rights: transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, and so on. So there is a close link that the expert advice that I got from these experts helped us greatly to understand more fully.
Yes, please, this microphone.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming and for your example of graciousness. It's very wonderful. I'm a graduate student. Yeah, no, I know. That's good too. I'm a graduate student in geography, so I know some of the answer to my question. But I was wondering, you alluded briefly to economic approaches to some of these problems in China and India, raising the populations out of poverty, presumably through their economic expansion. Yes. But I'm guessing that maybe there are some stark economic arguments that you would want to modify. I've read a lot about neoliberal economics and the idea that I hear in various forms from people that all we have to do is get them jobs and they'll be fine, you know, and this won't be so much of a problem. I wonder, I mean, it's a huge topic. Where do you start when you are faced with people who come to you with that argument?
I think it's a very relevant issue for all of us to think about how we really ensure that developing economies are actually going to develop in an appropriate and sustainable way. The International Monetary Fund had a very strong ideological economic theory that one of the things holding back developing countries was sort of bloated bureaucracies, and that if there could be a very strong slimming down of bureaucracies, that this would help. In other words, to privatize a number of services in the area of health, even in the area of education, etc. And many people, and I'm in this camp, believe that this actually was extremely unhelpful on the whole for many developing countries. That in fact it made weak health systems even weaker and weak education systems even weaker, and that it privatized for an elite in many developing countries. So you had a few private schools and a deterioration in a lot of the schooling. That part of the problem now with the pandemic of HIV and AIDS is that the health systems are extremely weak and have been weakened further by these approaches. So I think if we think even briefly about how most of the economies in Europe that are now leading economies there, and also the economy of this country actually grew, there was a lot of protectionism. There was a lot of protectionism of vital industries and sectors. That's how it was done. And to have an economic theory that didn't apply in the countries that are now strong economically and apply it seems to me not to have been a very appropriate approach. I must say that a lot of my thinking of these issues comes from another hat that I wear as president of Oxfam International, and I in fact wore that hat when I was in Cancun. We're trying to address in a sustainable way how really to build up economies. But I have to say that Oxfam would feel strongly, and I think that this is the correct approach, that we do need a multilateral rules-based trade organization, that we need a fair multilateral rules-based organization in order to have genuinely fair trade. We're not there yet by any manner of means, but rather than want to get rid of the WTO, it's a question of trying to have a trading system that is multilateral and that is fair. And there is, I'm glad to say, a lot of discussion about that at the moment, how that can come about. And part of it coming about is to strengthen the negotiating strategy of developing countries. And there's a lot of work being done on that, and we're helping a little bit. There is a group of trade lawyers in Geneva working with us as human rights people on how to skill up the negotiating powers of developing countries so that they can work better within the tough trade law world of the WTO and follow the small print of what is being proposed and protect themselves against some of the agreements that were entered into in the past which haven't been helpful, whether it's in relation to the IMF or in relation to the WTO. If you don't have economists and smart trade lawyers on your side, very often you enter into a bad bargain, and that's also part of the problem. It's a huge issue. I don't think I can do any more about it this evening.
Thank you. Just a few years ago, the United Nations General Assembly special session on HIV and AIDS, the so-called UNGAS on HIV and AIDS, produced a document, 50 pages or so, a blueprint for the world to really deal with this epidemic. Very comprehensive, and probably listed all of the factors and forces and risks that you and I could put our heads together and come up with, except one. It made no mention in 50 pages of men who have sex with men and the risks that they face in this disease. I guess my question then is, do you, based on your experience and travels and so on, do you consider prejudice, discrimination, and oppression of gay and lesbian, bisexual people worldwide to be a major human rights issue these days, or not? I don't know what your answer will be. I'm eager to hear. And if you do you consider the ungassed strategy of avoidance to be the way, or a good way to deal with this problem?
Well, thank you, first of all, in the context of the kind of discussions we've had for raising the issue of HIV and AIDS and referring to that special session of the UN. A lot of the time I do focus considerably on the issue of HIV and AIDS because it's such a human rights issue. I'm going to come to your question, but I'll just very briefly say, if you look at the figures in sub-Saharan Africa, some 29 million in sub-Saharan Africa are HIV positive or have full-blown AIDS. Of those, more than about 60% now are girls and women, and there's a higher prevalence of girls being infected. Many of the women infected are married women who have never had another partner. They're infected by their husband, in effect, and they're very vulnerable because they're in a marriage where it's not possible to say no because women are not empowered to be able to protect themselves or require their husband to use condoms or whatever. So it's a huge problem of a pandemic. But of that 29 million, a tiny fraction, about 100,000 have access to antiretroviral drugs and treatment. And that, to me, is an absolute scandal because it's not actually right to health anymore. It's right to prolong life. And it's the right to prolong life of young parents, of teachers, of doctors. In a country like Zambia, more teachers are dying than Zambia can train teachers to replace them. And it's the active population that are affected. But to answer your question very directly, yes, stigma and discrimination are a huge factor, both in the context of HIV and AIDS and as a human rights issue. And the gay and lesbian and transsexual and bisexual community are very seriously affected by it. And it is an issue that I raised as High Commissioner for Human Rights. I've met it in many, many contexts. I just think of one to illustrate. It was in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in about November 2001, I would say. And I sat in a room with a group of gay, sexual and transsexuals. All of them were HIV positive. All of them had horrific stories of discrimination to talk about. Not being treated in hospitals, being driven out of their homes, being abused by the police, not able to get visas to travel and visit this country or see relatives, all kinds of issues, one after the other. And to sit in a room of people and be aware of the sort of stark nature of that. And interestingly, and we talked about this, I had come relatively recently from a visit to Brazil and specifically to Rio de Janeiro, and I saw there a very good practice, if I could put it that way. I visited a local office of the city Department of Police and Justice. It wasn't just a police station, it was also a justice department. And I went up to the top of it to 2 rooms which had been given free to the gay and lesbian community in Rio to use as their hotline place. So they had their telephones and their PCs and their computers and things all working from there. The telephone calls would come in. The voice dealing with it was a voice from the gay and lesbian community, and they would take details, but the potential for follow-up was there in the premises itself. It was an extremely thoughtful, effective way of dealing. And just the contrast, in one you had a person-centered, appropriate way of dealing with this issue where if people were being attacked, victimized, discriminated against, or that they had a hotline and an effective response. And the response initially had been quite tentative, but became much more of an effective response when trust was built up between those who were manning the hotline and the police who were going to deal with situations of assault and victimization, etc. So it is a very big issue. Violence against the person, for many reasons, is still a huge human rights issue. Amnesty International are launching a campaign starting this Friday. It'll be launched in London, which I'm also supporting, on violence against women, which is an extraordinary, when I say extraordinary, it's in our globalizing world of rapid change, it's a problem that's growing. And part of that problem is attacks on women who are in any way marginalized, and particularly because of their sexual orientation or because they don't conform to cultural norms in certain societies, etc. So at all stages, those who are more vulnerable are more likely to get attacked, and part of the human rights message is definitely, unequivocally, to be in support and to know that these are important human rights issues.
Hello, Ms. Robinson. I'd like to thank you on behalf of our Amnesty International group on campus. We're right back there. And I'd just like to ask you a very quick question. At what age do you believe is appropriate to begin teaching children about human rights abuses and other unpleasant things to learn about?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm in favor of beginning it appropriately young, but doing it in a way that instead of sort of shocking with terrible images, etc., learning that children should know about rights, know that they themselves have rights, that others have rights that must be respected, and in that sort of way. And I'm very much in favor of human rights being approached not in a kind of classroom set context of a teacher talking about human rights. It just goes over the head. It doesn't mean anything. But engage in either role play or go out and see a situation. Go to a refuge for women who are there because they've suffered from violence, and listen to some of the stories they talk about. Make it a real experience of learning to respect the rights of others, including parents, teachers, as part of a human rights. And then I think it's really very good if it can be done early. I have to say, in relation to that, I used to put a lot of emphasis on human rights education, and of course the key document for human rights education starts with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the international level. And I forgot to mention, wearing my Irish hat again, that I got the Guinness Book of Records for the Universal Declaration. It's the most translated document in the world. I think it had been translated to about 320 languages at that time, and now it's translated in order that it would be available in indigenous groups, minorities, in all the languages of the world, that there would be a text for human rights education.
Hello, Ms. Robinson. I'm a Salish and Kootenai person from the Flathead Nation in Montana, and I came to greet you and express sincere gratitude for your work on the world stage in championing human rights and for your efforts at making peace.
Thank you.
I have a specific question for you. At the United Nations, many traditional Native nations don't believe that they're being heard. And we are questioning whether that's the appropriate forum, since only nation states are, voting members. I guess I wanted to ask you if you believe that there's another forum in which indigenous peoples are being heard, and wanted to let you know that in North America you have way more fans in Indian country than you could ever count. And don't stop.
Well, thank you, first of all, for your warm greeting and kind words. There is now, and I must say I did support it strongly as High Commissioner, there is now a new forum. It's actually called the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, which meets every May in New York as part of the UN. And it's one where indigenous peoples, their representatives, are in as part of the deciding. It's partly government representatives and partly indigenous representatives. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I know it's only a few that can get direct representation, but still it is a step forward that, it is dealing with a whole range of Indigenous issues. I'm very happy to know that at the meeting in May this year, the first session will be on Indigenous women. And I think that's a really good session because they also need a lot of focus, and it will be a very good opportunity for their voices to be heard. And there are a couple of Indigenous women who are members of the forum itself, who are the deciding, the body that decides what the forum will discuss. So I've heard that point you've been making. It's taken an awful long time to try to have a declaration on Indigenous issues. It hasn't been agreed, and part of the reason is problems of land rights, communal rights, a sense of the identity of peoples. But it's better that these things be talked about in dialogue, and I think the UN can provide a useful forum for that.
One postscript I wanted to say is that our long-standing governments have never relinquished their authority, and we only await the proper forum in which to join in the world dialogue on peace.
Okay.
First microphone, be short, please. We have another about 7 people.
Hi, thanks for coming. I was curious if, with the occurrence of in both Rwanda and in Bosnia, if there's concern for people having a false sense of security with the presence of UN troops, and if so, if there's any commitment that's trying to be made for those people in the future.
I think there has been a kind of realization of how much there has been a failure, a UN failure, a failure of the strong member states who effectively can decide on resources and policy of the UN in situations like that. Rwanda was a terrible moment, a shameful situation where there was a report, in fact, by a human rights expert, a very good African human rights person who subsequently came to work for me in the Office of High Commissioner, is still with the office in New York, Bakra Wali Ndiaye. He was the special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings. He visited Rwanda in August of 1993, and he reported and said, I'm very concerned. If we don't do something, there will be a genocidal killing. And he had seen the way that the radio was being used to whip up ethnic hatred by the Hutus of the Tutsis, the Mil Colleen radio and other ways of communicating, the whole tension. And it was a case of just the human rights voice not being heard. But when the attacks began, the small number of UN troops were withdrawn, and as you know, the Canadian general, who is in a very difficult situation, has spoken out very courageously and very frankly about that. Similarly, in Bosnia, it didn't prevent a terrible massacre, and the situation is not one that anybody involved in the UN looks back on with much pride. The question I think you're really asking is, how do we ensure that things get better? There have been so many reports. There was a very good report by Lakhdar Brahimi on strengthening peacekeeping, peace and security. He's the very good UN official who headed the UN mission in Afghanistan and who was recently in Baghdad to try and assess the situation there. He's very experienced, and he made a range of recommendations. If they were implemented, it would make such a difference. Both the previous Secretary General Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan have at some point wondered if the UN could just have some kind of a reserve force to be available for urgent situations. That has never been agreed by the member states. There's an under-resourcing, there's an under-capacity. When situations arise, such as is now arising in Haiti, which has arisen also recently in Liberia and elsewhere, it's very hard to get countries to commit troops. At the moment, it's not precisely UN, it's NATO in Afghanistan. Any of us who've been to Afghanistan, I was there as High Commissioner. I thought that in Kabul itself, The role of the ISAF, the international force, was compellingly good in the sense that it had provided the necessary security at that early stage to allow President Karzai to begin the process of building up his government and so on. But if you went outside Kabul, where I went to Mazar-e-Sharif, round the next corner, you were unsafe because there was no real guarantee. The warlords were effectively still running things, and the situation, I think, has worsened in certain parts of Afghanistan. So that, to me, is a huge moral crisis at the moment. Surely we won't let Afghanistan unravel, but if we're not careful, it might. Now, that's not actually pointing a finger as much at the United States. That's pointing a finger at European countries. Why is it that the European countries, Germany in particular and others, that have some troops with the NATO cannot augment their commitment and have real security for the Afghan people? So in a way, the UN is kind of, it's the whipping boy, and it's understandable that it's the focus of criticism, and that criticism is sometimes very justified. But the UN depends on member states providing resources and particularly troops. It doesn't have any separate army. It doesn't have any. The peacekeeping of the UN depends on troops being provided by member states, and it's not an adequate response to the human rights violations that occur during conflict. But unfortunately, we haven't moved on properly in a sustainable way, and we should.
Unfortunately, we can take only one more question and stop this question and answer period, because President Robertson is talking from 3 o'clock without any stop for different audiences. Please, one more question. I think first microphone, right?
Okay.
Please.
Thank you for all your work. My question is hopefully very simple, but maybe very complex at the same time. What do you think about nations like the U.S. using economic sanctions to foster political change and respect for human rights norms, and repressive states like Burma?
You think that's an easy question? It's extraordinarily difficult to deal with countries like Burma, Myanmar, when there's such a respect for sovereignty. I understand why there's such a respect. That was the focus of the Charter of the United Nations, to respect the sovereignty of countries. But it means that the capacity to really influence when there are egregious, terrible violations of human rights is very limited. And one of the ways is to try to apply sanctions, economic sanctions. The dilemma is how to ensure that those sanctions don't make the situation worse for the poorest and most vulnerable. To have, in other words, what they call smart sanctions. It's the same thing in Zimbabwe at the moment. Smart sanctions that affect Mugabe and his colleagues at that end, not the terrible suffering of the Zimbabwean people. So whether it's individual countries, whether it's UN sanctions, I think the problem is always the same, that it's very hard to have them as smart and targeted as people would like in order to be effective. And yet we need to use all the tools we have, because it's hard to get change in human rights, and it's necessary to put a certain pressure at certain times, the alternative being, to me, a less acceptable alternative to engage in military force. So I think that what we're learning is that what will really put pressure on a country like Myanmar is effective pressure by neighboring countries, by the ASEAN countries, ASEAN itself. And if they can be persuaded, and they are getting closer to it, to put real pressure, that is what will have effect, more, I think, than any sanctions by a country such as the United States.